Okay, so at this point, hopefully you understand the concept of inversions, you understand the concept of triads. Triads have 3 notes, 7th chords have 4. And they're generally going to be tertian, which means they are stacked in thirds. So let's get into this. So you've got a few different 7th chord qualities that are commonly used in the classical period. If you're a jazz musician, there's additional ones, but this course isn't dealing with jazz music. We have to focus really on classical music because at this point in time, that's what most colleges focus on in an undergraduate program. And this also serves as a basis that you can then expand upon and learn other styles. It's not that classical style or tertian style is superior in any way. It's not. It's just that this is where we tend to approach music from a Western perspective. And so once you understand the fundamentals, you understand the logic behind the Western system with the overtones and how all that helps us to influence what we're actually creating in music, then you can go on and you can study other types of cultures. And that's actually where it gets really interesting, because now you have something to compare it to, and you can really open up your mind and start to create some really interesting music once you start to get outside of the restrictions of the tonal system. So 7th chords are going to be built on your basic triads. So if you look at all of these 7th chords here, the first one, just playing the triad, C, E, and G. Second one, C, E, and G. The third one has a minor triad on the bottom. The fourth one has a diminished triad on the bottom. And the fifth one also has a diminished triad. So our 7 chord qualities are based on both the triad and the actual 7. So in the first example, you'll see that there is a major triad, so that's what the first big M indicates, with a major 7th. So we've got C, E, G, B natural, and it sounds like this. One way to abbreviate this, again, we like to abbreviate things, we just write M7 because the second M is redundant. So we would call that a major 7th. The second one is a major minor 7th because it has a major triad on the bottom. And then in the key of C, that B flat is not in the key. It's actually a half step lower, so it's a minor 7th. It's the interval of a minor 7th. So this one, the major minor 7, we write M, lowercase m7, or it's often referred to as a dominant 7th, because it is the 7th chord that naturally appears on the 5th scale degree in a major key. The next one is a minor minor 7, so that means you have a minor triad, and then you have a minor 7th. Same as a major minor 7, but you'll notice the triad is minor. The diminished minor 7, you have a diminished triad, and then you have the minor 7th. So again, the 7th is staying the same as the minor 7th and the dominant 7th, but the triad has been turned into a diminished triad, which gives us a diminished sound. We can also call this one half diminished, and we tend to write it with a circle, like a degree symbol, with a slash through it. The final one, if you take that minor 7th, you keep the triad the same, and you just lower it a half step, you get a fully diminished 7th. And this one is a series of minor thirds. Now, while you might be tempted to write this as C, E flat, G flat, and then A instead of B double flat, if you do that, it's not technically a 7th chord. Technically now it's a different type of chord. So we'll talk more about that in a future session. But it's important that you spell all your 7ths in thirds when we're dealing with classical and romantic period music. So we call this fully diminished because it's a series of minor thirds. From C to E flat, minor third. From E flat to G flat, minor third. From G flat to B double flat, minor third. So our 7th chord Roman numerals. Just like with the triads, you can build 7th chords on each scale degree. So in the key of C major, if you look at scale degrees 1 and 4, they're both major 7th chords. But look at scale degree 5. It's a major minor 7th. So that's our dominant 7th. We don't do anything special if we use Roman numerals. We just write 5, 7. because the 5/7 implies that it's a major minor 7th chord because we're basing it on the key. So that's just something you have to remember. A 1/7, a 4/7, and a 5/7, they're going to be different qualities. The 1 and the 4 will be the same, the 5 will be different. Another thing is that a 7 chord in tonal music is very uncommon. There are instances where we will talk about in future lessons, but the 1/7 chord, if you ever think you see a 1/7 chord, think again. Unless it's a jazz piece or a more modern piece, that 1/7 doesn't really happen. That 1 chord is almost always going to be a triad. And the reason for that is that triad sounds stable. This B, that B creates a need to resolve up. So for that reason, we don't want to obscure the tonality of the key, so we typically don't use the 7th on a 1 chord. You'll notice that the 2, the 3, and the 6 are still minor 7th chords, and our 7th scale degree is a half diminished 7 chord. So you've got a diminished triad with a minor 7th. If in the minor keys, you'll notice that the scale degrees that are minor are going to be 1 and 4. The major ones are going to be 3 and 6. 3 is also a chord that's not used too often. And again, in a minor key, probably not going to use a 1/7. We want to use a triad because it's more stable. But you'll notice also what happens here is on the 5th scale degree, we raised the G to become a G sharp. That's so that we can have that dominant 7. Even in a minor key, in the classical and romantic period, they wanted to have a major dominant because they wanted it to fit more closely with the major scale. A minor scale was considered secondary. It was considered sort of a weaker key. So if a composer, which happened rarely in the classical period, wrote a piece in minor, it was usually in an internal movement, which happened quite commonly, or more rarely it would be an opening movement. So they tried to avoid that because it just wasn't very stable. So the way that they make use of a minor key is they create that dominant 7. So we still have the leading tone, which is the G sharp. If you remember your scale degrees, the leading tone scale degree 7, that G sharp still has that minor 2nd pole to resolve. Okay? So if you look at the 7 chord, if you raise the leading tone, and it can occur either way in a minor key, but when you raise the leading tone, you get a fully diminished 7th chord. If you don't raise the leading tone, then you actually end up with a major triad on the bottom. So it actually becomes a different type of chord. But often what happens is we like to use that diminished 7 chord in A minor if it's going to appear at all. So this is something you should really memorize. You should memorize this chart. You should learn that in a major key you've got a 1/7, 4/7, 5/7 that are essentially major, knowing that the 5/7 is dominant. And you should know that 2, 3, and 6 are minor 7s, and that the 7 chord in a major key is going to be half diminished. And you should also memorize the minors as well. These are important. Okay, so same thing as with the triads. If you look here, you've got C, E, G, B. That's a major 7th, and we're indicating the position with numbers. So that 7 refers to a 7th above the bass note, the root of the chord, C to B. The 5 refers to a 5th above the bass note. The 3 refers to a 3rd. Oops. So if you look at the chord right below it, we don't need to write 5 or 3 because you look at all the other chords, there are no other 7 chords where there's a 7 between the root and the highest note. So we just call it a 7th chord. That's why in the Roman numeral slide on the previous slide, you saw a 5, it just had 7. It didn't say 7, 5, 3 because the 5, 3 is redundant. If we look at the next chord, this is a 6, 5. So what we've done is we've taken the C and we have moved it up here to the top. So now the 3rd is in the bass. So you could label this from top to bottom as a 6 because E to C is a 6, then E to B is a 5th, and then E to G is a 3rd. Or you could just call this a 6, 5, which is what we typically do. So if you have a triad that's in a seventh that's in first inversion, you label it as 5, 6, 5. We don't write the 3 underneath it. And another way to think of this is that a first inversion seventh or triad has a third in the bass. So now if you take the E and you move it on top, you end up with a G in the bass. So we already have a triad called the 6-4. That's your second inversion triad. So we don't want to use that again. So what we do is instead of having a 6-4 triad, we just take off the 6 and we call the second inversion seventh chord a 4-3. And you'll notice the fifth is in the bass. So with seventh chords, we have one additional inversion to deal with. So here we have the seventh in the bass. So again, we just take off the 6 on the top and we indicate that this is a 4-2, because we can't use the top two numbers because again we already have a triad called the 6-4. That would be the second inversion triad. So to make it clear, they cut off the 6 and they just use the numbers 4-2. And the seventh will be in the bass there. So memorize the fact that a seventh chord is indicated by a 7 when it's in root position. It's indicated by 6-5 when the third is in the bass, 4-3 when the fifth is in the bass, and 4-2 when the seventh is in the bass. So seventh chords are going to have various uses in tonal music. They can create stronger resolutions because of the distance between the root and the seventh. Anytime you have a dissonance, it creates a need to move forward. So that seventh has a strong pull to resolve. The seventh of the chord wants to come down. The third of the chord wants to go up. So if we look here at C, E, G, and B, typically you'd make that a B flat, and that would create a minor seventh between the root and the seventh. And that seventh wants to come down by half step to an A. Even if you have a major seventh, that seventh still wants to resolve down to an A, and then the E still typically wants to resolve up to an F to get that nice third there. So seventh chords can be used to also smooth out voice leading, because if you have what would otherwise be a skip, sometimes you can include a seventh chord that allows for smoother voice leading. So this is it. Next time I'm going to be talking about the phrase model. This is an important concept if you want to pass those graduate entrance exams, and I will explain more next time.